Joining us is Ed Fitzgerald, Cuyahoga County Executive. He's also a Democratic candidate for the governor of Ohio. Tell us what this is all about and why we were seeing something that looked like blackmail, looked like basically trying to withhold unrelated funds to help people vote, and why this has changed tonight.
Sure. Well, we've had a kind of a crazy 48 hours. It was yesterday that we found out that the legislature had inserted a provision and then passed it out of committee that was going to cut 10% of our local government funding for the sole reason that we were talking about trying to protect people's right to vote by sending out vote-by-mail applications. And for 24 hours, basically, we scrambled to try to figure out what kind of legal recourse we could come up with to try to stop this. Now, we've beaten them before, Ari, in court, but this was a different tactic. Instead of fighting us in the courts where we have won consistently, they said, well, let's hit them in the pocketbook. And by the way, these funds are the funds that we use for police and fire services, for EMS. I mean, this is the cheapest of cheap shots. And so this morning at 10:30, we contacted the Justice Department, submitted a memo that basically said that what they're doing is coercion, it's extortion. We think it's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, it's a violation of the Voting Rights Act, and we asked for a Department of Justice investigation. After we did that, then the dominoes started to fall, and the good news is, as of tonight, they have backed off.
And of course, part of the Voting Rights Act has fallen under the Supreme Court ruling last year, but what part and what argument did you make that this violates what remains on the books?
Well, basically because what they're talking about changing has had a disproportionate effect, particularly among African-American voters. So if you look at the early voting provisions that they have tried to reduce in recent legislation, that's something where African-Americans in this state were 3 times more likely to avail themselves of using those provisions than non-African Americans. And so it clearly has had a discriminatory effect. And again, we're used to fighting that battle with them in the courts. This was the first time where they tried to coerce us by actually taking the funds away that we use to provide services for all of our residents on a daily basis.
And do you think that the problem they had politically within the Republican Party in your state was this tactic? I mean, this is what we're emphasizing, this sort of blackmail or this attempt to withhold the money, because we know that Republicans have been very aggressive about limiting aspects of the vote. Yeah. That's not controversial. So is that sort of what backfired on them here? Well,
let me point out, we reacted to this yesterday as soon as we heard it. The Governor Kasich refused to comment on it yesterday, and so did the Secretary of State. It wasn't until, I mean, literally, we were at federal court at 10:30, and it wasn't until after we did that, Ari, that the Secretary of State came out about an hour later, and then the governor came out an hour after that. The bottom line is, I think they know that this was a violation of the law. I think they know damn well what they were doing with this, and I think they did it intentionally. And I think once we called them on it, and once we stood up to them on it, I think that's the lesson to be learned here. That when these types of attempts at voter suppression happen, we have to be just as strong and just as determined on the other side.
And when you look at that ruling I mentioned, what John Roberts and many conservatives on the court said, and a lot of folks in the conservative, philosophical conversation said, look, we don't need all of the Voting Rights Act anymore because we're in a different world. We don't have these kind of problems. Do you have a different view of that after this week?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, we've learned 2 things in recent weeks, unfortunately, in Ohio. Number one is that they are willing to pass laws and pass voter restrictions that disproportionately affect certain portions of our electorate, particularly African Americans. That's number one. And number 2 is they are willing to go to extreme lengths, and not just within the court system. They're also willing to use political pressure as well. It was really pretty shameless, and luckily we had a big outcry about it. We brought in the Department of Justice and notified them about it, and they backed down.
Yeah, and I cover voting rights issues a lot. I couldn't think of another recent instance in the modern era where you had this kind of defunding over access to the polls. Pretty strong stuff, and interesting to see the responses you're getting. Ed Fitzgerald, Cuyahoga County Executive, thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you, Ari.
Now, you may have heard